Let's talk now about how flooding and propaganda are used as a form of censorship and information control. We'll talk first about the notion of flooding and how it is used to introduce distraction in conversation, discourse, and communication on the internet. There are many definitions of propaganda. One definition is offered by Yochai Benkler and colleagues in the book Network Propaganda, where he defines propaganda as communication that's designed to manipulate a target population by affecting its beliefs, attitudes, or preferences to obtain behavior that's compliant with the political goals of the propagandist. Now, this is a somewhat more narrow definition of propaganda than some other definitions. It explicitly talks about intentional communications that are targeted at a population, and it has a politically oriented perspective on the definition of propaganda. A more general definition of propaganda is the systematic dissemination of information to support or discredit a cause, a point of view, or a topic. Propaganda has various effects, including induced misperceptions, such as disorientation, the blurring of the distinction between fact and fiction, as well as distraction, where in contrast to disorientation, there's no attempt to engage in debate, but rather the primary purpose is to distract and redirect public attention from discussion or events that could result in collective action. Here's a well-known example of distraction, where the Chinese government uses the so-called 50 Cent Party or the 50 Cent Army to post hundreds of millions of fake social media comments a year to introduce distraction into discourse as a way of diffusing the potential for collective action. One can think about propaganda and its uses along a number of axes. Benkler has this taxonomy, which draws a spectrum between political and commercial, as well as a separate axis between institutional and technological. One can see that in this multidimensional space, there are a variety of mechanisms and purposes that are used to disseminate propaganda or misinformation. Sometimes the goal is simply to make money. There are well-known examples in the area of fake news, for example, where so-called entrepreneurs might post clickbait articles that are known to be false with the sole goal of getting people to click on them to sell ads. There are other cases, of course, that involve more overt political goals. In all of these cases, there is some varied use of technology, ranging from the simple use of mainstream media to more sophisticated uses of the internet and social media platforms. So why might a censor choose to use propaganda and flooding over more conventional mechanisms like filtering? Research has shown that often blocking access to information can backfire. It can foment dissent and protest, and additionally, citizens may seek access to software that helps them circumvent the blocking, resulting in greater access than they had before the attempt to block even took place. We'll see some examples of that in the coming few minutes. So an alternative strategy to filtering is to flood. One can create distraction, change the subject, or make it difficult to find information by flooding a particular medium with large amounts of information. China's 50 Cent Army, as we've discussed, is a good example here, but examples abound everywhere, including in the United States, as we'll see. Here's a particular study from Molly Roberts that showed how blocking access to a particular site can backfire. In this particular case, one can see a case where China blocked access to Instagram. Using geotagged posts, one can track the use of Instagram in China both before and after this blocked event. And although one can see that overall the number of geotagged posts declined, there's still a significant number of users on Instagram from China, indicating that about half of the users of Instagram before the block somehow found access to Instagram even after it was blocked, indicating that a significant number of users actually gained access to potentially all blocked websites, for example, through the use of a VPN. The data about Instagram is also corroborated by observations of increased VPN usage around the time of the block, as you can see here. In terms of how software such as VPN Express and VPN Artifact increased in popularity on the Apple App Store immediately after the Instagram block. It's also interesting to note that the popularity of these applications persisted well after the time of the block, indicating that decision to block access to a particular site can actually have fairly long-lasting residual effects in terms of the population's use of circumvention software. Similar effects also can be seen in terms of the number of followers that both the Apple and the New York Times received after the Instagram block. What we can conclude from this data is that it appears that many of these new followers to these accounts, New York Times and Apple, were users that joined Twitter immediately after the Instagram block and suddenly began following Western sites. Yet again, demonstrating that the choice to block access to a site like Instagram can actually have significant knock-on effects as far as the population gaining access to circumvention software and subsequently using that circumvention software to gain access to a much broader array of sites and information. Researchers have shown that the Chinese government has taken a somewhat extreme approach to the alternative of flooding, hiring as many as 2 million people to surreptitiously insert large numbers of deceptive posts into social media. But while the 50 Cent Party is a somewhat extreme example of the use of propaganda on social media, this phenomenon is by no means specific to China or even non-Western countries. As you can see here, the practice is actually also somewhat pervasive in the United States, and these examples are all more than 10 years old, indicating that the idea or the notion that social media can be used for propaganda is certainly not new. The notion of using propaganda for distraction also dates back decades to other industries, including the tobacco industry, and even more recently, sporting associations like the National Football League, who've used propaganda to distract the discussion away from the relationship between playing football and head injuries. In summary, flooding might be the most dangerous form of censorship. It takes advantage of our limited attention span. It's rarely illegal. It can be difficult to identify. And as such, it's not subject to the same types of risks that an overt filtering action might encumber, such as fomenting a protest, dissent, or collective action, or causing people to install circumvention software that ultimately increases their access to information. Flooding, on the other hand, takes advantage of longer-term trends in the increasing amount of information that's available to us online. Due to this flood of information that we're already receiving, it's perhaps no longer the most strategic move to simply apply filtering, but rather to introduce more information into the flood in an attempt to distract us or disorient us.